Please welcome to the stage Matthew Desmond and Darren Walker.
You? You want me to? I can take it. What do you want? All right. You? Okay. You got it. Okay.
Please, Matthew. Welcome, Matthew Desmond, distinguished professor of sociology at Princeton University. I am greeting you again on one of our book talks here because you came with your Pulitzer Prize winning Evicted, which I'm always proud to point out. You got a Ford Foundation fellowship. So we're happy when we see our fellows go on to win Pulitzers and do great things. But this book, Poverty by America, such an interesting title you chose.
Yeah.
So let me just say, I dog-eared so much because, and we only have a short period of time relative to what you've written, the depth, the breadth, the level of provocation encased in this book is quite remarkable. But I want to start with the thesis of this book, because the thesis of this book is really something very profound and different, because the book is really not about poverty and poor people as much as it is an indictment in all of us, people like me and you, as complicit in actually benefiting from and succeeding in part because we've allowed a system and structures that actually perpetuate our benefit to be, well, again, to be sustained over many, many years. So I'm implicated. It's my fault. There's poverty. That's what I take away from this book.
Yeah, mine too. Yep. It's great to see you, my friend. Thank you so much for having me. The title came, I was in an airport, and when you're in the airport and you see those like big Chanel ads, and they're like Chanel, like number 5 by Chanel, and I was just like, poverty by America, it just kind of was like, there was like this, but then it kind of stuck, and I thought it fit, because this is part of us, we really stand out against other advanced democracies for the depth of our poverty and the amount of it, right? So we don't just have more child poverty than other countries like South Korea or Canada. We have like double. We have double. A giant amount of poverty in this land of dollars. And so why? And I think the why is about us. Those of us who are college educated, who are homeowners, who are lucky, who are secure. I think that some lives are made small so that others may grow. And I think we just have to have a blunt conversation about that and not start putting it on other kind of things. There's this line in the novel There by Tommy Orange, where he says, kids are jumping out of the windows of burning buildings, falling to their deaths, and we think that the problem is they're jumping. And when I read that, I was like, man, that's like the American poverty debate. For over 100 years, we've been focused on the poor, and we should have been focused on the fire. Who lit it, who's warming their hands by it.
Well, and as someone who's very steeped and interested in the history of philanthropy, I'm reminded that it was Andrew Carnegie who first popularized the idea of the worthy poor.
Yeah.
This notion that there are some among us who are poverty-stricken who deserve to be there because they are slovenly, they make bad choices, they are lazy, and these notions that remain with us today, as well as his idea that the wealthy, the most noble and honorable thing a wealthy man, because he was speaking to wealthy men, could do was to give back. This notion of, well, you're successful and you've succeeded, and now it's time to give back. And I think a lot of Americans, and the very people you indict in your book, don't see themselves as complicit. They see themselves as charitable, as honorable, as generous Americans who, by giving to their homeless shelter or the Red Cross are helping.
Yeah, they can be both, right? They can be connected to the problem and therefore the solution, and they can also be honorable and generous and big-hearted. And I think that many of us are embroiled in this problem in ways that we don't understand. But the way that Americans is set up is that just going about your daily life, gets you confronted with the fact that, am I living my life in solidarity with the poor? So many of us consume the cheap goods and services the working poor produce. We often talk about shareholder capitalism as if it's like 15 guys in a smoky office somewhere around here, but like half of the country's invested in the stock market. Aren't we implicated when we see our savings going up, even when that means someone's wages have to go down? We have this weird imbalanced safety net. When we think of the welfare state, we often think of food stamps and housing assistance, but social insurance programs and tax breaks are part of that system too. And if you add all those up, you learn that the country gives most of the families that need it the least. And then
You're saying that because of the home mortgage deduction
Sure.
That you mentioned in the book, that's one of the biggest tax giveaways that actually is deducted from our bottom line revenue on an annual basis.
Yeah, and it's weird. I mean, some folks are like, wait a minute, like a tax deduction isn't like a welfare check. But, if you think about it, they both cost the government money and they both put money in our pockets. So for homeowners to get the mortgage interest deduction, for example, which costs the government $190 billion a year, which is like triple what we spend on direct housing assistance to the needy. Homeowners could get that by deducting it from their tax bill, or the government can send them a check, same difference. So I think we have to face the fact that there's this huge welfare state that many of us benefit from, which often we don't pay attention to unless those programs come on the chopping block. And then suddenly they become very visible to us, don't they?
Well, it's also interesting because you clearly are prepared to take on the issue of race. And I'm reminded here at the wonderful Ford Foundation, because I do love our history, because it's full of such paradox and contradiction. But there was a meeting of the trustees in the late 1960s, and our board meeting, and our trustees then were all white men, and Henry Ford II chaired the board, and McGeorge Bundy was our president. But the theme of the meeting was the Negro problem in America. And literally, there was a binder full of like experts, all sorts of economists, sociologists, cutting edge research, and it was everyone literally took the microphone and said, the problem for Negroes in America, I mean, it was literally like that was the conversation. And we supported some work around the Kerner Commission, and there was some thing in the archives about an assessment of why President Johnson and actually his advisors were worried about what the Kerner Commission was producing, because they said the results of this commission's work is very disturbing and problematic, because the results of the work was to say the Negro problem in America is white people.
Right.
I mean, is racism and a history of exclusion and discrimination, and that is a significant part of why there is, quote unquote, a problem. And your book, you're very clear that there are systemic reasons why blacks are disproportionately in poverty.
Right, and I think we have to be super wary of any theory of that absolves the real issue. We're pretty good at absolving theories, getting out of it and not writing ourselves into the story. And we have to write ourselves into it. So if you just look at, for example, the housing crisis, the story of Black America, right, is a story of slavery to sharecropping, then to Reconstruction, this moment of sunlight, followed by racial terrorism, the Great Migration, where Black folks were corralled into ghettos in places like Pittsburgh and Milwaukee and Chicago, where they literally didn't own the land. It took Martin Luther King getting murdered in '68 for us to get the Fair Housing Act, which created these places that were segregated now by race and deep poverty, all the way up to the foreclosure crisis, where we know Black communities were targeted by predatory lending companies. So that's all created this semi-permanent renter class where most black Americans are still renters, and are exposed to the eviction crisis and rent hikes, and most white Americans are homeowners because the government invested in our homes. And so it's impossible, right, to write a book about poverty by America without also writing a book about racism by America.
And you talk about the ways in which entitlement programs, as we know the term, is often perverted and misused.
Yeah.
And people, the narrative about these programs is that the waste and corruption is perpetrated by the welfare queens.
Yeah.
And these narratives that have been deeply embedded in the American psyche. But you do some great work of just demonstrating one after the other of how elites and people who are accountable for the way these dollars get spent and how they actually, I mean, the example of the Mississippi and Brett Favre and TANF, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
Talk about that.
So when Clinton reformed welfare, he reformed it into a block grant, which is just a wonky way of saying, all right, the federal government's going to give states pots of money and then give them a lot of discretion about how they use that money. And states have used a ton of creativity on how to get that money out. So for every dollar that's budgeted for cash welfare, only about 22 cents ends up in a family's hands. So what do states do with that money? They fund Christian summer camps and abstinence-only education and marriage initiatives, anti-abortion clinics. And Milwaukee just straight committed fraud. I mean, the folks that are in charge of the TANF program bought each other trucks, paid for speeches by Brett Favre and the $1 Million Man, who was a professional wrestler when I was growing up. And these kind of things. Mississippi made all the headlines, but this is like the normal routine thing happening at the state level. There's only one state in the country, Kentucky, that gives most of the money directly to families in direct aid. A lot of the states don't even spend the money. So Tennessee is sitting on about $700 million in unspent TANF funds. Hawaii, our bluest state, is sitting on so much that they could give each poor kid $10,000 in their state. So this isn't just a red-blue issue or just a Mississippi fraud issue. This is an issue of us doing a terrible job connecting families to resources they really need.
And we often talk about, for poor people, and the working poor, because more poor people are working, that this conversation and debate around wages. And obviously, there's been a lot of economic theory, and in fact, an economist won a Nobel Prize based on this notion of demonstrating that if you raise wages, you kill jobs. You reduce the private sector's capacity to actually create new jobs. And these narratives and how they become so hard even after tremendous levels of rigorous research debunk them, how they remain a part of the larger narrative.
Yeah, that was the work of George Stigler. He was an economist in the 50s, and he really worried that there was a minimum wage debate, kind of like there is today, and he worried that a little increase would cost jobs, which kind of intuitively makes sense, actually. If you have to pay workers more, you're going to hire fewer of them. And so he wrote this paper, and he encouraged economists, we can't be for this, we have to be against this, it's gonna be bad for everyone. And that became part of economic lore, dogma, but it was based on no data, zero data. It was just a theory, a mathematical theory. It was beautiful and clean, but there was no data. And so a pair of economists in 1994, David Carg and my late colleague Alan Kruger, were like, we should probably test this. And so there was an experiment where Pennsylvania didn't raise its minimum wage, but New Jersey did. And so they were like, all right, let's compare these two states that are really close to each other and see if fast food jobs get lost massively in New Jersey. And it just didn't happen, actually. And so since then, there's been a ton of evidence showing that Stigler's worry was overblown. A lot of Democrats say, if you raise the minimum wage, people are going to spend more, it's actually going to create jobs. That doesn't seem to be the case. And a lot of more conservatives think that, you know, if you raise minimum wage, it's going to kill jobs. That also doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to have a net zero effect on jobs. The question I think we should also ask too on this is like, what are we denying people when we don't pay them a living wage? And the evidence on that is pretty scary. We're denying them health, happiness, life itself.
But then there are ways in which, you know, very new, fresh ideas have gained currency, like UBI,
Yeah.
which is now certainly among the Silicon Valley guys, because they're all guys. I mean, but you know, this idea of UBI seems to be a significant. I don't want to say they think it's a silver bullet, but they are very excited about turning this into a more systemic response to the current economic circumstance for low-wage people. What do you think about UBI as a solution?
So I think the beautiful thing about UBI is that there's no qualification, right? And often when we have the conversation about poverty, there's a qualification, a Carnegie qualification, right? Like, you know, I remember when Bernie Sanders was running for president, he said, no one who works 40 hours a week should be poor. It's like, okay. But what about someone who has a disability and can't work 40 hours a week? What about someone who has a drug addiction? And, you know, what about someone, you know, I don't think anyone should be poor in America, period. Like, just period. That doesn't mean we're all equal, but just no one should fall below a certain standard of living. UBI kind of accepts that idea, and I think that's a really beautiful thing. But I think the problem with UBI is when people say, all we need to do is this, then all our problems will be solved. I think that's not true. And there's part of me that's like, you know, part of the book is, a big theme is power, right? And exploitation, and us getting over on each other. And UBI kind of says, yeah, that's going to happen, and we're going to fix it later. I don't think that we should accept that. I think that we shouldn't accept anyone falling below a basic standard, but we also have to attack exploitation in the labor, housing, and financial markets. And that's something that the UBI conversation doesn't get us into, and I think we should get into that.
Well, because part of the UBI idea is being advanced by a group of very powerful, wealthy white men who live in one neighborhood. I mean, on its face, I think there's a reason to have some scrutiny of that idea. And also just the notion that we come to accept as normative that people will work and they will not have an income. They will not be compensated in a way that they can live with any modicum of dignity, and therefore we need UBI.
Right. And we shouldn't give up on work, you know?
No.
I mean, work should be fulfilling and dignity gratifying and affirming, right? And this, you know, the idea that we're just going to walk away from work for a giant chunk of the American population seems like selling them out in a really serious way.
Well, I think there is concern because I want to go to a part of the book that I thought was very clever, where you gave a talk at Harvard, and one of the scholars was very alarmed, and she said, "You know, you're going down a Marxist path."
Yeah, yeah.
Are you a Marxist,
Yeah.
Dr. Matthew Desmond?
Yeah, I gave this talk called Exploiting the Inner City. And for my last book, I lived in a mobile home park and I lived in a rooming house. And when I was living in the mobile home park, the landlord let me see his books, like his financial books. And so I could calculate his profit margins. And it took me a while to calculate it. But by my calculation, at the end of the day, the landlord of the poorest trailer park in Milwaukee, which at the time was our fourth poorest city, was taking home over $400,000 a year after expenses. And his tenants were like on SSI and, you know, were really, really struggling. And that blew me away. You know, that really stuck with me. When I started writing Evicted, I was like, why would you own a trailer park? And then when I calculated that, I was like, oh, why wouldn't you own a trailer park? You know, and so since then, we've done a lot of research on, is that true? Like, is that weird? Or is that something that we can see in the statistical data? And it turns out you can, you know? in most cities in America, landlords in poor neighborhoods don't just make more, but make double landlords in rich neighborhoods. Now, it doesn't work out, doesn't pencil out in this city.
In New
So,
York,
in
no,
New York.
that's not what real estate.
It's not, so in New York, it's better to be a landlord in Soho than the South Bronx. But in like most other cities, but New York is the weird city. In most other cities in America, we know, it's the other way around. And so that, that's what the talk was. It was clean, it was empirical, there was confidence intervals, And, but even talking about exploitation and using that word really made folks kind of sit up a little bit. But it's a word I think we should use. We should just face the fact that, a lot of folks are not getting paid what they're worth today because we're exploiting them. A lot of landlords' profits are much higher in poor neighborhoods than middle class or affluent neighborhoods because the poor don't have another choice. And when you're in that over a barrel, you get overcharged for things. We should talk about the fact that banks are, charging customers $11 billion in overdraft fees every single year. 9% of bank customers pay almost all of those fees. The poor made it pay for their poverty. So I just think that word has to come into our conversation about poverty. Because when we ignore exploitation, our policy solutions are going to be watered down at best and diluted at worst, canceled out at worst.
Well, but how do we, there's a strong sense in this country among many that the market will solve many of these issues, and that for an entrepreneur to take risk in a poor neighborhood where delinquency rates are going to be higher, where defaults are going to be higher, that that market, from a risk analysis and underwriting, well, it's a high-risk market.
Totally.
And so what's exploitive about recognizing that I'm going to put my capital at risk in this high-risk community? It's not about race it's just about risk assessment.
Yeah, totally. I think a theory of the problem isn't a theory of the person. And there are some property owners that I've met that are really criminal, are really just after the bottom line, are willing to, do really nasty things with their tenants, are willing to drive their properties into the ground. But I've met a lot of others that are just trying to make it and are trying to do right by their tenants. And so the risk calculation can be behind this problem just as much as greed. And so if you're a property owner in a poor neighborhood and you don't know, and I'm a property owner, you're all my tenants, and I have no idea which one of you is going to cost me money, my risk signals are not that great, I will socialize my risk by overcharging all of you. And it is true that risk is higher in poor neighborhoods, relatively speaking. It's higher than in middle class or affluent neighborhoods. But because risk is still pretty rare, absolutely, a lot of that risk charge is assumed as higher profits. So it can absolutely be the case that prudence also gets you, overcharged or exploited just as much as greed. I think that the exploitation argument forces us to have a conversation about what an excessive return is. So if you're a landlord in West Philly and you're making 5% on your investment, 6%, S&P rates, things like that, I think a lot of us would be like, that makes sense. That makes sense. But if you're making a 20% return, 30% return, I think we might say, geez, that comes at a real human cost. Like, is that too much?
Well, is it too much if you look at the internal rate of return for a normative real estate portfolio is 20%, which in a lot of markets it is.
Yeah, but in this market, right, the cost isn't just, there's a higher market for consumers, right? The cost is eviction and homelessness and hunger. The research on what people do when they finally get a housing voucher after years on the waiting list is really moving, because what they do is they buy more food and their kids become healthier and less anemic. So the human costs we're bearing for that, those kind of markups are pretty extreme.
So how do we reconcile that, Matthew? Because, taking a hard-nosed, I mean, the human costs are not the problem of the real estate landlord. I mean, his concern is keeping his apartments rented to people who will pay. Obviously, the human costs are important, and we have to mitigate them. But I'm just making the argument that I agree with you about your diagnosis, but is it fair to implicate the landlord as the culprit for all of this, or are you making the case that actually we're all the culprits and not just the landlord is a central culprit in this narrative, but we're all the culprit?
I think that's fair, but the landlord conversation is a fire conversation. Mm-hmm. It's about the fire. And we can debate the landlord, but notice the debate we're having, And so, like, if you ask me, Matt, what does the best social science research say on eviction? Why do people get evicted? I would be like, okay, here's what the data say. Race really matters. Gender matters. Women get evicted at higher rates. If you live with kids, actually, it really matters. You get evicted at higher rates. But, like, people aren't evicting themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, the law professor Harold Koh once wrote, when we don't measure what's important, we might make important what we can measure. Mm-hmm. And so we've spent the last 60 years since the war on poverty measuring poor folks and their families, right? And that's what our data say, and that's a jumper conversation. And I love the fire conversation. Mm-hmm. So for example, we have a study that shows that the top 100 buildings in Tucson, Arizona evict 3/5 of the city. So now we're suddenly like, I don't know, who are these guys? Why are they doing all the eviction? Because we're catching that. The cities are catching that in the social service, in the homelessness, in the school system. And so we're subsidizing that on the back end. So, they should be part of this conversation. But again, like, we can't, like, anything that absolves us of this problem, I think we should be very wary of.
But the fire, in my mind, the fire goes to the fact that we made a policy decision that the government would cede to private developers building low-income housing.
That's right. Reagan cut HUD's budget by almost 70%, 70%.
Well, just as Margaret Thatcher did in the UK. I mean, right. in Germany, I mean, in many places, private developers aren't actually the culprits because they don't actually own much of the housing stock for poor people or for lower income people, because it's the role of the state to house lower income people. But in our country, we have absorbed this market notion that actually let the market, with subsidy, with housing vouchers, of course, of which you point out there's not nearly enough, but that's how our system works. So yes, the developer is the culprit, but actually the culprit is a policy that says we're going to actually turn over to the marketplace the responsibility for housing a poor, low-income, and often challenged population of people.
Yeah, I totally get behind that. But I also want, talking about bad apples often is like, we shouldn't do that, it's more systemic. But there are bad apples, and they should be held accountable. And right now, there's no, we don't even know who owns our cities. We have no idea who owns New York City and who's doing all the evicting in the city, and what landlords are treating their tenants really well, and what landlords are being very abusive. We don't know any of that. We can't reward folks that are providing a public good. We can't really hold accountable folks that are pushing the boundaries.
Well, and we know, obviously, this used to be something I did in Harlem for 8 years, and what we know are the really bad guys, right? I mean, we know
people that are in the trenches.
Right.
Now.
Well, and actually, the city knows because they do collect that data because they have to, because often, as we saw in the fire in the Bronx, that data is very useful in understanding what some of the root causes are in some of the fires that we have seen, which
Yeah.
are often code violations and
Yeah.
and a lack of investment in infrastructure in
Yeah.
these buildings, which often have poor infrastructure.
Yeah, but then there's also these questions that because the corporate shells of homeownership,
exactly.
that it's really hard to
Yeah.
like gentrification doesn't just happen. Someone gentrifies, and who does it?
Yeah.
And like in Rochester, New York, they passed this little law that says if you're going to evict someone, you just have to use your real name. Just a little thing, but like they're just like, we're going to keep an eye on it.
Right.
You know, so I like this idea of transparency and accountability, but I also like where you're bringing us, where, you know, it's not just about pointing to the bad apples. It's also, you know, inspecting our lives and the policy decisions that many of us have gotten behind that leads to these kind of, you know, problems too.
We're going to go to questions and answers for Dr. Matthew.
At least questions. Yeah, I don't know about
Questions
answers.
And his brilliant answers. So if you have one, please go to the mic. But I love this line here that you, because I'm a huge Ella Baker fan, but I never saw this. So you quote her as once saying, "Those who are well heeled don't want to get unwell heeled, no matter how they came by their coin." And this is a really powerful, classic Ella Baker.
Yeah, yeah, it just cuts right through it, right? Just sees the clear truth in it. No abstractions, no beating around the bush. And I think our job as, you know, as I hope a room full of people that want to abolish poverty, that want to be over and done with it, I think is having a hard conversation, because this isn't a win-win argument, right? This is an argument about some of us are going to need to take less from the government. But I think that part of our job in trying to get us there, get more people behind that, is casting a broader vision of what that means. Because I think it's not just all sacrifice. I think what we get from that investment is a better country, you know, a freer, healthier, safer country. And I think a lot of us are pining for that.
Yes, but it's also on a personal level. I mean, it's, you know, when I write in my book, this isn't about giving back, it's about what are you willing to give up.
Right.
On a personal level, people get very, I had a conversation with a group of progressives,
Yeah.
Including some prominent African-American New Yorkers who are friends, and I raised the notion that most of them were educated in Ivy League schools. Most of them were poor as children, but because of affirmative action, we all got to where we are today in part. And I said, I think the time has come to end legacy admissions. Well, this group of progressives, there wasn't one person at the table who agreed with that. Now, to your point about and you know who really didn't agree? Were the black people. Because the black folks we were the first generation, and so now we have a chance to have our children have some privilege, and you want to end the program. Right? And so the tension was real from different, you know, but the point was about power and privilege and advantage.
Right.
And no one seemed willing.
Right.
And, you know, as I said, the black folks, I could kind of, you know, I mean, my mother, who grew up very, very poor, I mean, literally, you know, dirt poor, her dream was to own a home. As you said, she raised 4 kids on her own. And so when, you know, I was able to buy her house, and we go and we're looking at this house, and, you know, she always wanted a big ranch house in Houston. And we're looking at this house, and I'm standing there at the agent, and I say, you know, Mother, this house is not energy efficient. You really should be looking at it. And she looks at me and she says, why is it that when I am ready to have my dream house, I get a lecture on energy efficiency? Nobody gave white people a lecture on energy efficiency. When they bought this house, nobody told them they can't have their dream house. Why are you know? And I'm like, well, that's part of the reason we're in the situation we're in.
Yeah.
Because I'm sorry, but this house is not energy efficient.
Yeah.
And, you know, but her point was just simply, black folks never had a chance for legacy admissions or to have their dream house. And now that we have it, it seems like, you know, we've been invited to the party and the bar has been closed. And so you know, this is a real issue
Yep.
when you talk about power, because you really go right to it.
Yep.
You go right to the issue of who has power, who has advantage, and who's willing to think about giving some of that up in a belief that actually higher education will be better if your children aren't advantaged
Right.
because of who their mother or father or great-grandfather was.
Yeah. It really shows how little we really believe in meritocracy, you know, at the top. That idea, fairness really scares a lot of folks. The dinner party, there was someone at the table who believed that. It was you. And I think that...
Yeah, me, who didn't go to an Ivy League,
Yeah,
who went to a public
right.
school in Texas.
Well, you brought it up. But you brought it up.
Well, of course.
Well, this is how we change the social common sense of the country. These awkward, weird, hard conversations, because the status quo is reproduced not only by Congress and in law, but by elites, but also like micro little tiny interactions, like when you're at your kid's soccer game and your neighbor comes up and says, you know, did you see that proposal for that affordable housing? You know, like it's reproduced there in that moment. Or when tax season comes around and everyone right, left, and center is like, oh God, taxes, you know? And so these awkward conversations where, you know, the next time someone brings up taxes, for example, you know, you say, yeah, like I own my home and I get this mortgage interest deduction, which is insane because there's like 1 million public school kids that are homeless today. So I donated my deduction to my local eviction defense and I wrote my congressperson telling her to like wind this thing back for people like me. That's a completely different, weird, uncomfortable dinner conversation. But I think that's how we get more of us to start acting on something that we kind of believe. And I think that we've seen this in the environmental movement. Like a lot of us are like, yeah, I believe climate change is real. I'm going to do my part. But we don't really act on that until like we drive down the street and like notice that our neighbor put solar panels on, or our neighbor got an EV, or our kid starts eating, you know, vegetarian or something like that. Then we start moving in that direction. So I think, in a way, you know, what you did in that conversation was model how I think we need to like enact poverty abolitionism in a day-to-day life too.
So what is your, in this moment when inequality, polarization, the sense that many who are advantaged feel that they earned it, that it's theirs. They are disciples of Ayn Rand. They believe that they created it.
Yeah.
And therefore it's theirs.
Yeah.
Or like the lady who I sat next to at an event in Texas who said, you know, I want to end the death tax because this money belongs to my grandkids.
Yeah. Yeah. I think belief is a pretty strong word, and I don't know if we believe it. I think we say it. So it feels, that kind of thing to me feels like what Hannah Arendt called propaganda. You know, and so she said, you know, propaganda isn't something people believe, but that organized us. It's like a cliche of inequality. Where, I remember when we had our first kid, people would tell us, oh, you know, do this, do this, do this. And then pretty soon I realized like they don't believe it. They're just like words are coming out of their mouth. It's a thing they say when they realize someone's pregnant. And I feel like when you bring up the inequality debate or the poverty debate, often people will respond like this to shut down the conversation. But I think if you pick at that a little bit, I don't think people believe it in their hearts at hearts.
So you think it's more performative and not
Yeah.
truly internalized?
I think it's much weaker than we thought. And I think it's changing. You know, I think, you know, most Americans now don't think the rich are paying their fair share of taxes. Most Republicans and most Democrats now think that poverty is a result of unfair circumstances, not moral failing. So it's kind of like that old Gramsci line, like the old is dying and the new hasn't been reborn yet. And I think this is a moment that's pretty pregnant with promise about telling a different kind of inequality story.
Well, thank you, Dr. Matthew Desmond, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. This book, which you all will get because you came today, and I know you will enjoy reading it and be provoked and enraged and inspired as I was. Matthew, we're so grateful that you came to the Ford Foundation.
Oh, it's an honor. It's so great to see you.
Always love to see you.
Yeah, I'd love to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have a question for Matthew Desmond?
I do, if that's
Please.
okay. Thank you. It was incredibly interesting to hear both of you speak on this book. I have not yet read this book. I did read Evicted, and I think one of my questions, you spoke about the market as a solution, as imperfect as it can be, and it seems to me, I'd be really interested to hear from each of you about the idea of, for many of us, I think owning property, owning your own home has been held up as a way of building wealth. And it seems to me that that may be in direct opposition to the idea that housing can be affordable. And I don't know if that is more, if we're looking at individual level versus somebody who's operating a business, but I'd be really interested to hear what your thoughts are on how housing as a form of building wealth could be in opposition to that, or perhaps I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you certainly know from your research.
So homeownership often is talked about as like this kill a lot of birds with one stone policy, because those of us who have benefited from homeownership in certain neighborhoods, it's like magic, right? Your mortgage payment stays the same forever. Your wealth goes up just by, for no, work of your own. And you get this giant tax cutout, right? And so when that's proposed as a solution to, for example, address the black-white wealth gap, the assumption is like as if the homeownership will happen in segregated white communities that have hoarded opportunity and been behind our kind of conventional idea of homeownership. I don't think that's true. And I think that if we really want to get serious about the black-white wealth gap, we have to do something much deeper than just expand homeownership. I do, however, think that in certain markets, this one isn't one of them, providing better on-ramps for Americans to get into first-time homeownership is a solution to the affordable housing crisis. So last year, 27% of homes that were sold in America were for $100,000 or less. 27%. Big part of the market, affordable homes. But only 23% of those were financed with a mortgage. The rest were kind of brought up by land speculators, landlords, private equity. So what's happening here? Well, it costs about $7,000 to initiate a mortgage, no matter how big the mortgage is. So banks just aren't interested in giving folks a mortgage for $50,000, $70,000. They'd much rather underwrite $1 million mortgage. They're going to get a lot more back. So this is where the government and philanthropy, I think, could step in, building more on-ramps to incentivizing lenders to provide access to homeownership. And that could make a big difference. I remember I met a woman in Cleveland named Lakia Higbee a few years ago. She was working at Amazon Picker, and she was renting a 4-bedroom home in Cleveland for $950 a month, which she didn't think was bad. She lived there with her adult kids, 2 of her grandkids. But if she bought that home under conventional mortgage standards, her payment would be $570 a month, with no rent hikes. That's real money. So I do think that is one of many solutions to the affordable housing crisis, but it's not going to work in cities like this, but it can work in a lot of different markets.
I think the history of intergenerational wealth creation in this country has to be considered as one reflects on your question, because it's important to understand that the greatest program of social mobility ever created in American history was the GI Bill. Yeah. And the GI Bill provided 2 things. Among the things it provided, the 2 most notable and that had the most economic impact was the returning veterans got a free education, and they basically got a no down payment mortgage.
If they were white.
And thank you. They were provided an opportunity, therefore, to have both foundations for economic mobility. Black veterans were not offered those benefits. And that program created really the foundations of our modern economy, and certainly the greatest wealth transfer in a generation up until that point. Right? And so those Levittown houses out on Long Island that Granddaddy bought for $28,000, when Granddaddy dies, is worth $700,000. And the 4 grandkids split up that amount of money. And that's the down payment on their house. Or that is how they finance their child's education so their child doesn't have college debt. So, or that is how they start a small business. Right? So we don't have in our community the opportunity for friends and family. Right? So the way Bill Gates, his father, could walk around the floor of his law firm and in a week raise $1 million, that's friends and family. Well, African Americans don't have that. And so the question of housing, and certainly at this foundation has been one we looked at some 25 years ago when Susan Beresford was president. And in fact, we invested in what up until then was the largest experiment in home ownership for low to moderate income families. And that was a program with Fannie Mae where we provided basically a de-risking subsidy. But basically, it was a no payment, no down payment, because so many of the folks had $500, but that was what they put down. I mean, everyone had to put something down. So it wasn't like free. You had to. Unfortunately, what we learned in the long-term evaluation was that over half of those houses ended up in foreclosure because of the 2008 housing crisis, well, financial crisis. Right? And you may remember that there were some members of Congress who accused Fannie Mae of demanding that the banks make loans to unqualified applicants. And so your point about the woman who, if she had a conventional mortgage, she would pay $450. Well, if she had a conventional mortgage and she had a 780 credit score, she would pay $456. But if she's likely to be a working class single mother paying $900 a month in rent, she probably doesn't have a 780 credit score. So the dynamics of our system, both at a macro level, right, and then at the individual household level, is really complicated by systemic racism issues. And again, we're not even getting into the redlining and the things that you get into in Evicted and here. So your question is really complicated, but it's not actually. It's not. We know why certain people today, even in a market like New York City, can't afford, because somebody, some time ago, for many of these folks, had some asset that they could monetize or collateralize and own a home today. Those assets, black people in this country, I mean, well, in fact, for a while, as you know, in some places, it was illegal for African Americans to transfer any wealth to an inheritor. So anyway, it's a very, very interesting dynamic that always as much comes back to issues of history and race and economics and how it's been practiced in this country. We have two. Wonderful. Please. Thank you for that great question.
Mr. Walker, Dr. Desmond, thank you both for your profoundly impactful work. It is life-changing.
It is.
The discourse now is sort of front and center when it comes to the wealth and income gap, whether it's racial or not, or how we address it now. Even Warren Buffett has gotten in the game now, saying that compounding is the 8th wonder of the world.
He's right.
And there
And
are
it's worked. for some people.
And there are initiatives underway now called Invest America 2024. The state of Connecticut is issuing baby bonds and all of these things now to address this issue of compounding and being more inclusive when it comes to this notion of compounding. I would be very interested in your thoughts on how we get this done and maybe some simple prescriptives, some solutions on how we can be more inclusive as some of the capitalists are in this room.
I'll do my best. This book, there's a lot of policy in this book, but this also is a book that I want readers to act on in their own personal lives. And part of that is about investing. We used to talk about sin stocks. Remember when we used to talk about sin stocks?
Yep.
And I'm going to get out of sin stocks. I don't want my money going to pornography or weapons, or we kind of do that with Exxon. I don't want to. But like, economic justice often isn't in our equation about sin stocks, and we kind of just say, well, I'm not going to look into their union policies, their wage policies. And I think we should put that on the table, and I think that consumer activism has moved the needle on a lot of things in America. And I think that we could bring that into our investing and our shopping decisions. Not because that's enough, but it reminds you day to day that you got skin in the game. Like, and we often do this, like, here's my locally grown cucumber from this farm down the road. Like, we do it with other values. We have no idea how much the farmhand got picking it, right? We know what coffee to drink to signal that you're this kind of progressive, but we often don't know how much the baristas make. I was in London a few months ago. If you walk down the streets in London, there's these stores, and they have like a sticker, and they'll say, this store pays a living wage. Our stores have a lot of stickers these days, but they don't usually have that one. And so I think that those kind of things could be useful. On the investment decision in general, I think that I'm attracted to baby bond ideas. I think groups like In Poverty in California are now talking about really investing in wealth in a different way, a minimum wealth idea. But I also think that it's not just about giving folks that haven't had it something. It's about really rethinking the whole system and really trying to divest from exploitation as much as we can.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think about this institution's billions, to your point, and often at a place like a Ford Foundation or Harvard University, the notion is, well, we have to maximize returns because the more we generate, the more grants we can make, and that's true. But part of in my own interrogation of our behavior as an institution was really looking at that endowment portfolio, and you find some really disturbing things.
Yeah, I think that for all of us, and I'm not into this too. I belong to an institution with a very big endowment, right? That isn't, and so this is where, like you, I can flex a little bit of my influence. Like, what are we invested in? What is my 401k invested in? And I think when you start scratching that, you often have a few come to Jesus moments with your family. Yeah.
Yeah, like you're the largest funder of criminal justice reform and ending private prisons, and you have an investment in prisons.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's really interesting when it happens. Yes, please, our final question.
I just want to say, I think my generation is doing a lot of, not to be self-aggrandizing, but I think we are talking about labor and what a dignified life looks like and a living wage. And I think in New York in particular, which obviously is a liberal bubble, we've had organizing groups to kind of start discussions about, what people really believe, et cetera. I guess my question is, I think that voting, first of all, I think there's a political framework that needs to be implemented. But I guess my question is, for so many people in my generation, they feel like voting is kind of imposed as, especially in the general election, the presidential election, as a must-have opportunity, when I think that progressive ideologies, UBI, et cetera, or Medicare for all are just not really as embodied by the Democratic Party for the younger generation as they would have liked. And so when we have a Ron DeSantis or a Trump, we're kind of, I'm just curious what political solutions would you suggest besides just voting or, starting reading groups? Because I think my generation has really started that and really questioning, are billionaires ethical? Is corporate greed? We've seen a summer of strikes, but I guess my question is I think that political solutions just feel kind of limited for some people.
Yeah, totally. I think that, well, I don't know what your generation is, but I think you're younger than me. And when I published Evicted and I went on the road, no one really brought up capitalism. Like capitalism wasn't on the table, After this book, everyone brings up capitalism that are like your age, younger than me. Capitalism's like up for debate now. Your generation has made capitalism up for debate in a way that it wasn't even just like 7 years ago. I think that's really promising and exciting. I think that we can take a note of hope from the 60s. In the 60s, Congress was a mess. Dixiecrats were aligned with Republicans to block reform. Senators slept in their offices to filibuster. Sound familiar, right? And then in the face of all that, we got these major pieces of civil rights legislation, and we got the war on poverty and Great Society, like the modern social safety net. And if so much was accomplished despite the odds, it was because often movements fueled by young people in the civil rights and labor movements, put unrelenting pressure on Congress. And so I think that should give us hope and should mean that voting is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And it should mean that we cannot be quiet even in the face of what looks like extreme political obstacles. The other thing I'd like to challenge us is we need a language that is not just negative. We need to celebrate the wins. And I think that for all of, I think that progressives on this score are a little less developed. We know how to critique stuff. We are so good at critique. But when it comes to being like, that was good, that was necessary, that feels like an act of courage to say that. And we saw this, I think we saw the results of our silence or our bumbling language around celebration in COVID. In COVID, for 2 years, we had a different country. We had a different country. We reduced child poverty by 46% in 6 months. Evictions were the lowest they've ever been on record ever, even after the moratorium. Most people ended the pandemic financially better off than when they started it. All of this was because the federal government issued bold relief. And we were really quiet about that, actually. We were really quiet. We had a lot to say when the emergency rental assistance wasn't getting out the door fast enough. Everyone was tweeting and writing about that. But when it started reaching people and people started benefiting from it, we were just silent. And I think in our silence, those programs went away and 5 million more kids were cast into poverty last year. So I think we need to work on that too. And really cultivating that language of celebration, being like, this isn't the mountaintop, but look at where we've gotten. And we've got to reward, our elected officials when they don't give us everything that we want, but they give us a lot. I think we need to cultivate that language.
Thank you. Yes, sir, and then you, please, sir.
I have just a rhetoric question. What is your opinion? How the level of poverty in America would change if this country stop blatant exploitation of the third world country? So the rich could be poor, but what could be impact for poor Americans?
Yeah, that's like the clear, fair question to ask about my book, which I do not answer. The book is really America-focused, basically because it's hard. It's hard to really think of that, in a broad way. But this is the
nation, 170 million people working 7 days per week, 12 hours per day, and pay $36 per month. And the government of Bangladesh begging American company to pay at least $60, but they get $36 just to survive, to buy a cup of rice.
Yeah, no, so I'm not forgive me if I've sounded dismissive. I'm not dismissing your question at all. I'm just saying I haven't looked into it. I haven't studied it, and I haven't dug into it. But I think that when you think about exploitation, you clearly, it doesn't take very long to be like, well, what about across the border? What about this kind of global exploitation? What do we do about that? I think I would love you to write that book. I would read that book.
And actually, there's a very strong literature around the question of exploitation in the global South of both formal and informal workers. There's a great, I mean, this is not your domain of research, but there's a great body of work on that. And I think what has troubled some economists and labor economists especially is some of those patterns that we used to say, this is what happens in a third world country, which is the term we used to use, is now happening in America. I mean, I think the levels of exploitations that we used to talk about being overseas, we are seeing systematically embedded in our economy.
Yeah.
And for some, that's very troubling.
Yeah, I think you're also seeing, in the book, I borrow a phrase from John Kenneth Galbraith where he talks about private opulence and public poverty, where, and you see this when you go to certain cities in the developing world, and you see these big mansions surrounded by barbed wire and private security. But then you kind of think, are we sliding closer to that, or are we sliding closer to other countries in the West? Because a lot of us, we walk out of our $5 million condo in San Francisco and are surrounded by pretty public poverty and the disinvestment in the public sphere. And so I think that on that score too, there are these.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, from a planning standpoint, just as you said, there are more bunkered,
yeah, that's right,
gated communities, as we know. I was just in Sao Paulo and Rio, and yes, everywhere. And this is what we used to say, oh, we go to those places to see. We go to Johannesburg and we see block after block of barbed wire in the backyard around these houses. And actually we're seeing that now in America.
Yeah, right.
And so, yeah, there are trends, again, from housing and security and crime to trends around labor that are very troubling.
Right.
Yes, sir, you get the last question.
Thank you all. Thank you for writing this book. It really changed my life. I mean, this book really changed the way I view everything I do. I'm a government and policy person, and so this book really changed how I viewed things that I did in my work and how I do things in my work today. My question is, you talk about investing in the end of poverty, right? And a lot of that is, you say like we need federal policies to do that. And I agree with my co-question colleague about like the movements that the younger generation is making. I agree that in New York this isn't the market to buy a home, and I'm in that. I'm a homeowner, right? But and you also sort of indict us as homeowners in this book, and I was taken aback by that. It's sort of when I read it at face value, but I understand it. My question is it the federal policies that we need? Is it me? Like, is there something that I should be doing? I mean, social movements are great, and I think voting and things of that nature are also things that we need to be doing as a younger generation to sort of change what we're going to see in the next 10 or 20 years. But like, I guess I'm asking you to do a little foreshadowing. Is there hope? Is there a federal policy? We don't have a speaker right now, right? Like, so we can't even put legislation on the floor. So, where do you see us in 20 years from now? My 5-year-old is, going to be sort of in college, and I'm hoping to be able to, help him write that first check for his college tuition. I don't see myself at that. I'm not there right now, right? So where do you see us in the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for engaging with my book in such a deep way. That's really meaningful to me, what you said. When you write books, you can kind of see where they move the needle in an app, you can say, oh, that policy got changed, or, oh, that, you can see it in this kind of macro way. But the thing that's really moving is when people say things like this. that's really meaningful. And so thank you. You know, I think that we have to make our moral ambitions here very clear and not be embarrassed by those ambitions. Like when the Johnson administration launched the war on poverty in 1964, they set a deadline. They set a deadline for the end of poverty in America. Like we used to have moral ambitions to eradicate poverty in this rich land. And I think we can rekindle those ambitions today. And I think that means resisting these boring, pernicious, like best we can doism that's kind of gripped the American imagination, and really rejecting pessimism, which is in vogue these days. It's cool to be pessimistic and nihilistic. But often, you know, our hopelessness isn't very useful. Often the opposite. And so I think that we have to make big demands and execute. Do you know who's making big demands and execute? Are folks on the ground level. And so there's a little story in the book that you might have run into where, you know, I'm hanging out with this tenants' rights organization right before COVID in Minneapolis, and they were struggling against a negligent landlord, and they were fighting for their buildings, but they wanted to buy their buildings back from him, right? And so he's like, all right, raise $7 million. And they're like, okay, be right back. They're like a bunch of like undocumented folks and folks that work at the airport, security guards. And they ended up raising $7 million and made a fair market offer, but they also like protested him at his church and stuff. So he was kind of angry. So he moved to evict everyone. They were either homeowners or homeless. And it came down to a jury trial. And we were waiting. One of the tenant organizers turned to me and she's like, you know, what's taking this jury so long? They're asking themselves, why do these tenants want this raggedy building? And it's because people have forgotten how to dream. And when she said that to me, I was pretty convicted because I was raised in policy schools and we are not taught how to dream. We are taught what can get through Congress, what's realistic, you know, given the mess in Congress, and just, I don't know. So I think that spending time with folks like that, I think expands our moral imagination is really good for us. And I think that, yes, like we do need federal policies and renewed social movements, but part of that work is very individual. Not because, like, we're not going to solve climate change by hanging up our laundry, but it actually does matter that a lot of us have changed our lives in the face of that problem. And I think that that's the stuff of political will building. And I think doing that in solidarity with poor Americans is also part of the movement too. Because when folks say movement, people think like, do I got to chain myself to an eviction court, right? And I think a movement also needs like lawyers and accountants and nurses and marketers and all sorts of folks. So if you guys are interested in joining the anti-poverty movement, I have a website for you. We launched this website around this book called endpovertyusa.org, which just introduces readers to all these groups all around the country just putting in the good work. So that's a place to start.
Thank you. A final question. Please, Sherry Schultz, go to the microphone.
I was standing up because my back was giving me a hard time.
Now you got to get drunk now.
It's interesting because, Darren, you brought up the change in America after the war and the opportunity that was given to so many, and so many didn't get it, and the change that happened in America in terms of building wealth. There's not a boardroom in America that doesn't talk about ROI. Mm-hmm. There's few people that really understand incarceration in the prison system. Mm-hmm. But if we just took one thing, whether it was how we developed housing or the healthcare system, they're very big. But things like incarceration and the prison system, every person that's in that system that should or shouldn't be there, most of them not, if we developed an opportunity for education and vocation in terms of jobs that would transition anyone out of poverty in the prison system, just that piece would change everything. We talk about the foster care system, it's huge. But if we just change, like we did in the state of Washington, laws that actually prohibited these kids from being put into multiple placements. At the same time, when we talk about changing law, the state of Washington changed a law that said there was no kid that could exit the foster care system and be homeless. The problem was is that after the law was passed, they had no place to put them. So there has to be a deliberate sense of start and finish. Like when they ask you what your goals are in the next few years, you know, you do deep dives on books that take America to a place of understanding responsibility. And I think the opportunity is now to help develop not just the small social movements, but the actual movements that allow people, large and small, to begin to come together. Not just government, you know, not just the wealthy, but everyone taking a responsibility. The last thing I'll say, I'll tell you one quick story. I'm in a room that I was asked to meet with somebody that was a very big, let's see, she does huge events in Italy and very successful at it. It could be fashion, it could be branding, it could be anything. And we gave her a story about some of the projects that we were working on. And she said something that was, I mean, I'll never forget it. She said, during COVID, people raised money. You know, you do these dinner parties, it's $10,000 or $50,000 a couple, and you raise $6 million or $10 million for Children's Hospital or this or that. But during COVID, nobody could be together. So what did they do to help people that were the most in need, frontline workers? They brought all of these people that would never be on the cover of Vanity Fair and offered them an opportunity, and those people gave that magazine to 100 people, 200 people, 300 people, and before you knew it, they had raised 10 times the amount of money that the very, very wealthy would have raised at a dinner party or a black tie event by getting community to understand that they could all play a role by sending in $10. So I think we have to think big, take 4 steps forward, 2 back, but think big and think small at the same time. It's about community. It's about spreading the word. That's all.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Matthew Desmond, for this gift. Thank you for your unwavering, the arc of your career, which has been so much about helping America to confront itself, to look in the mirror, and to ask, are we who we say we are?
Right.
And this book does this so beautifully. So congratulations. Please join me in thanking Matthew Desmond.
Thanks, Dan. That was really great. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.